Hi, welcome to week 5 video 14. Today we will be talking about Sally Haslanger's essay, Social Structure, Narrative, and Explanation. And there she compares the idea of addressing different forms of oppression through talking about implicit bias and talking about them through the idea of structural injustice. Haslanger is a very similar thinker to Iris Marion Young. They take complementary and very similar approaches to dealing with political problems and trying to understand them philosophically. In particular, they both share an emphasis on the idea of structural injustice. So it'll be good to start actually just by reviewing what we read about structural injustice in Iris Marion Young's essay, Political Responsibility and Structural Injustice. So essentially, political responsibility and structural injustice gave us two sets of concepts. One is a pair of concepts around justice. We can think about individual injustice, which is just what we ordinarily think of when we think about wrongdoing, any injustice caused by an individual. But we can also think about structural injustice, and this she defines as injustice due to social structures that many people participate in. And going along with these two notions of justice are two notions of responsibility. So there's what she calls the liability model of responsibility, or just we can think of it as responsibility as liability. And this is when we hold individuals responsible for events that they caused directly. And there's a lot of discussion of the contrast between liability responsibility and political responsibility. But the point is that liability responsibility goes with individual action, whereas political responsibility goes with structural injustice. This is our duty to deal with injustices that are caused by social structures. So now we get to Haslanger on implicit bias and structural injustice. So implicit bias is a common enough term. People seem to understand it pretty readily. And it's one that gets kicked around in the media all the time. And so implicit bias is just an unconscious prejudice, like unconscious racism or unconscious sexism. So we can define it this way. Unconscious attitudes or stereotypes about groups of people that impact behavior. And implicit bias is a powerful tool for talking about things like racism and sexism because it allows us to talk about racist and sexist behavior without claiming that people have overt hateful beliefs. This is all operating at an unconscious level. And so this becomes very popular, for instance, in workplace diversity trainings. People will talk about implicit bias rather than explicit prejudice. So talking about implicit bias is good, right? It enables us to identify a mechanism by which individuals wind up causing harm to other individuals. But Haslanger's basic thesis is that it is not enough to talk about implicit bias. We also have to talk about structural injustice. And structural injustice was the key concept in Iris Marion Young. So again, we can continue to think about this as simply being injustice caused by structures, social structures that many people participate in. So Haslanger has two basic lines of argument for the claim that we need to talk not just about implicit bias, but structural injustice. One is that things like racism and sexism are primarily social structures. That's the key to them. They're not individual actions or attitudes, whether those attitudes are conscious or unconscious. Furthermore, we cannot right the wrongs of racism, sexism, etc. simply by focusing on individual actions or attitudes. So these two go together, obviously. Basically, the problem isn't individual attitudes, and the problem can't be solved by focusing on individual attitudes. So she has arguments for both of these theses. So for the claim that racism, sexism, etc. are primarily social structures and not individual actions or attitudes, she gives two reasons, two premises. First of all, racist and sexist attitudes are neither necessary nor sufficient for racial and sexual oppression. Well, she fills this out in immense detail later in the essay. But the basic point is that racism and sexism can persist even when no one is individually individually has these negative attitudes, either consciously or unconsciously. Furthermore, the moral problem is not the bad attitude, but it's the unfair relationship. If people have a bad attitude, and it doesn't wind up actually impacting how people go through life materially, and whether their lives are as fulfilling and rich as they could be, then that's not a problem. We're not here to identify people with bad attitudes and blame them for bad attitudes. We are here to change the way society is structured so that everyone has more opportunities to flourish. Okay, so that's on the side that says we need to focus on social structures. I'm sorry, that the wrong itself is a wrong with social structures, not a wrong with attitudes. So we cannot right the wrongs of racism and sexism by focusing on these actions or attitudes. Well, why is that? Well, one is that structural injustice can persist after attitudes change. This is going to be a lot of what we look at later in the essay. You're going to see situations where society was built by people with racist or sexist attitudes. And even though the racist and sexist attitudes, we can imagine that they have gone away completely. They haven't really gone away completely, but we could imagine that they go away completely, and yet the structural injustice still persists. The other thing is that people are really resentful when they are blamed for structural problems, and resentful people are resistant to change. So if you go around trying to root out the hidden sexism or hidden racism in people's souls, they're just going to get mad at you, and they're not going to change the fundamental power relationship. And that's what we're actually concerned with, the social structure. So these two come together. Racism and sexism are primarily social structures. We cannot right the wrong of them without talking about simply by focusing on individual actions or attitudes. Therefore, we need to talk about implicit bias. Therefore, it is not sufficient to talk about implicit bias. We must talk about structural injustice. And so you can think of the argument as flowing down in this fashion. From these basic premises, we get intermediate conclusions, and then we come down to the final conclusion. It is not enough to talk about implicit bias. We have to talk about structural injustice. Now, part of her argument here, especially for the claim that structural injustice persists after attitudes change and, racist and sexist attitudes are neither necessary nor sufficient for racial or sexual oppression, part of her argument here then hinges on what we're going to talk about next, which is Haslinger's ideas about social structure and explanation. Basically, she wants to get away from what she calls standard stories. Standard stories attempt to explain social phenomena by appealing to the conscious behavior of a limited number of individuals in a limited place and time. So, if you read history and you find that your history book is focused entirely on the actions of great leaders, then you're looking at a standard story that sort of says, the Roman Empire rose because these people were heroic. The Roman Empire fell because these people were cowardly, that sort of thing. But the fact is, social structures change differently. We can't explain social structures simply by looking at the actions of individuals. So what Haslinger asks us to do is look at three kinds of cases where you see injustice, right? But there are no individuals whose bad attitudes or actions are currently upholding those modes of injustice. And so this is what I want you to look at for the next exercise. So those three kinds of examples are examples of social constraints and enablements, social meaning, and material conditions and resources. So what I'm going to want you to do for the exercise coming up is look at her examples for these three sorts of things, explain them, and then come up with your own examples from the book that will help you, that illustrate what's going on here. And this would, again, I think, allow us to see how it is that structural injustice can persist even without implicit or explicit bias.